Alright, so we've got a multiplicative inverse. This is also known as a reciprocal. Does that sound more familiar?
Yes.
What is that? That's all that's on it. So, can anybody tell me what a multiplicative inverse or a reciprocal is? What does it mean?
Well, isn't the multiplicative property something that's multiplied by 0 to 0?
But we're not talking about a property right here. So, what if I have the number 3? Anybody tell me what the reciprocal of 3 is?
3.
How do I write 3 as a fraction?
3 over
3 over 1. So then if I have its reciprocal, that means I'm flipping it. So its multiplicative inverse or its reciprocal is 1 over 3. Okay.
So basically just flipping it over?
Yep, you're just flipping your numbers. If I multiply these two together, what do I get?
1 whole.
1 whole, right? 3 over 3, which is just 1. So, if I have the product of any number and its multiplicative inverse, so the product of any number and its multiplicative inverse is always 1. So the product of any number and its multiplicative inverse is always 1. So let's look at another example. What if I have the fraction 2 over 5? What is the multiplicative inverse of 2 over 5? 5 over 2. So if I multiply the two together, because product means multiply, right? What do I get?
1 whole.
I get 1. So it doesn't matter what numbers I'm dealing with, as long as it's a number and its multiplicative inverse, the product of those two is always going to be 1. So let's see. Let's find the multiplicative inverse. Is it okay if I abbreviate by just MI?
Yeah.
So find the multiplicative inverse. So what if I have 8 over 5? What is the multiplicative inverse of 8 over 5?
5 over 8.
5 over 8. What if I have 2 over 9? My multiplicative inverse is going to be 9 over 2. So all you're doing is flipping your numbers. If I were to multiply 8 over 5 and 5 over 8, what would I get? 1. What if I multiplied 2 over 9 times 9 over 2? I would get 1. What's the multiplicative inverse of 5 and 4/5?
5 and 5/4.
If I have a mixed number, I need to change it to an improper fraction first in order to find its multiplicative inverse. Okay. So how do I change this to an improper fraction?
Multiply by 5, which is 25, add plus, which is 29.
So I do 5 times 5, and then I add 4, and I keep the same denominator. So that gave me what? 29 over 5. 5 times 5 is 25, plus 4 is 29, and then you keep the same denominator. That's 29 over 5. So then what's the multiplicative inverse of 29 over 5?
5 over 29.
5 over 29. So if you're given a mixed number, you've got to change that mixed number to an improper fraction first before you can find the multiplicative inverse. Okay. Questions on finding the multiplicative inverse? Alright, so let's see how we can use this to solve equations. So we're still solving equations. Oops, spelled that wrong. And then we must check. So let's look at number 1. We've got negative 1/2 equals negative 5 over 18 h. So if I want to solve this equation, remember from yesterday and last week, you have to do the inverse operation to solve for h, right? So if I have negative 5 over 18h, that means I'm multiplying those two, right? Negative 5 over 18 times h. Yeah? So what's the inverse of multiplication? Division. So this is a side note. So say if I have to get h by itself, that means I would divide both sides by negative 5 over 18, right? So I would have negative 5 over 18 divided by negative 5 over 18, right? But how do I divide fractions? Do you remember?
Can you do the cross?
No. Keep, change, flip. So that means I keep negative 5 over 18. I change my division to multiplication. And then I flip my second number. So that means I have 18 over negative 5. What do these two numbers look like? Multiplicative inverses of each other, right? Negative 5 over 18 and 18 over negative 5. Those are multiplicative inverses. So this is equal to 1, which is what I want, right? I want h to be a 1h, or just h by itself. So, what if I just skip this whole step right here? Because if I divide by its fraction anyways, that means I'm just multiplying by its multiplicative inverse, right? So what if I skip the whole step of dividing the fraction, and I just multiply both sides by its multiplicative inverse? That saves me a lot of time. It's a little bit simpler. So let's say I want to multiply both sides by 18 over negative 5. Whatever I do to one side, what else do I have to do? I have to do the same thing to the other side. So that means I'm multiplying both sides by 18 over negative 5.
Do you have to put in parentheses?
No, you don't have to, as long as you put that multiplication sign in between so you know you're multiplying. I just think it's easier because it kind of separates both my numbers. It's easier to see. So when I multiply by my multiplicative inverse, that leaves me with just h. These two cancel out, right? So it leaves me with h on the right. And then I have 18 over negative 5 times negative 1/2. I'm multiplying two negatives, right? So I know that my answer is going to be a positive. So I can just plug this into my calculator. So if I want to make them a fraction, remember, you hit the first number, and then this ABC button right here, and it gives that weird little symbol. And then that's over 5, which gives me 3 3/5. And then I'm going to hit my multiplication button, and I'm multiplying it by 1/2. And that gives me an answer of, what does that mean right there? 1 4/5. So my answer for H is 1 4/5. Head off the desk. You're way behind. Head up, Mac. Alright, so I got 1 4/5 for H. Am I done yet? I need to check it. So I'm going to come over here and check it. So if I do that, that means I'm just plugging in 1 4/5 into H. So I'm looking at my original equation of negative 1/2, which is equal to negative 5 over 18, H. I'm plugging in for H. So that means I'm plugging in 1 4/5. It's going to be a little bit easier to plug this 1 4/5 into my calculator if I change it to an improper fraction. So let's go ahead and do that. So how do I change 1 4/5 to an improper fraction? Multiply and add, right? So that means I have 1 times 5, which is 5, plus 4 is 9. So I have 9 over 5. Now I can plug that into my calculator and see what I get. I know it's going to be negative though, right? A negative times a positive is going to give me a negative. So I'm just going to multiply 5 over 18 times 9 over 5. And that gives me 1/2. So negative 1/2 is equal to negative 1/2, and I know my answer is correct. Bless you. Questions on that one? So anytime that you have a fraction in front of a variable, in order to solve for that variable, you're going to multiply by its multiplicative inverse. Okay. Let's look at another example. I've got 3 over 8a, which is equal to 12 over 40. I'm still solving for a. I've got a fraction in front of a. So somebody tell me what I need to multiply each side by. Olivia. 3/8. Somebody help her out. What am I multiplying both sides by? If I've got a fraction in front of my variable, I want this variable to become a 1. So what do I multiply both sides by to get this as a 1? 8 over 3. I'm using that multiplicative inverse. That's what we just learned. In order to make this a 1, I can multiply it by its multiplicative inverse. So that means I'm multiplying both sides by 8 over 3. Anytime we have a fraction in front of a variable, we're going to multiply both sides by its multiplicative inverse, or its reciprocal, meaning we're flipping those numbers. Because 8 times 3 over 3 times 8, that gives me 1. They cancel out. Leaves me with a is equal to 12 over 40 times 8 over 3. So that means I can plug it in my calculator. 12 over 40 times 8 over 3 equals to 4/5. Am I done? No, I need to check it. So that means I have 3 over 8 and I'm plugging in a. So I'm plugging in 4/5. And that should be equal to 12 over 40. We should all be writing this down. So then I want to see if 3 over 8 times 4 over 5 is really equal to 12 over 40. So if I plug it in, I have 3 over 8 times 4 over 5. Which equals 3 over 10. Is 3 over 10 equal to 12 over 40? What if I simplify? Can I simplify 12 over 40? By what? So I can divide by 4? On both sides, or both top and bottom? So that gives me 3/10, which is equal to 3/10. So my answer is correct. Any questions? We've got to remember, if I've got a fraction in front of my variable that I'm solving for, I can multiply by its multiplicative inverse. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. And once I solve it, that's my solution. Okay? Are we good? What if I have decimals? So say I have 1.6k, which is equal to 3.2. I'm still solving for k. So what does 1.6k mean? 1.6 times k. So if I'm solving for k, I have to use my inverse operation. So what does that mean? What did you say, Carla? Is 1.6 and 6.1 multiplicative inverses? No. I can't simply just change decimals and numbers and everything. Multiplicative inverse only applies to fractions. So 1.6 is a number, isn't it?
Yes.
So can I treat it just like how we did it yesterday?
Yes.
If this is 1.6 times k, how can I get rid of 1.6? I can divide both sides by 1.6. So this is exactly like we did yesterday. My decimals changes nothing. I still solve it exactly like a normal equation. It's just decimals instead of whole numbers. So I want my 1.6's to cancel, so that leaves me a k. And then what's 3.2 divided by 1.6? 2. So k is equal to 2. So this is exactly like we did yesterday. It's just got decimals instead of whole numbers. Roman, write this down. So if I want to check it, I have 1.6 and I'm plugging in for k. So that means I'm plugging in 2. So then what's 1.6 times 2? 3.2. So my answer is correct. Any questions? Roman. Right here? I divided 3.2 divided by 6. 1.6. And it gives me 2.
Okay.
Any more questions? Okay, let's look at another example. So say I have negative 2.5, b is equal to 20.5. I still want to solve for b. What does this mean right here? That means multiplication, right? So I need to divide. I've got to divide both sides by negative 2.5. That negative it's tied with that number, so it cannot come apart from that number. So I had to divide both sides by negative 2.5. And then these cancel each other out, leaving me with a b. And then we have 20.5 divided by negative 2.5. And that gives me negative 8.2. If I want to check it, that means I'm just plugging in the number. So I've got negative 2.5 times negative 8.2. We should all write this down. If we don't write our notes down and we get home and we're confused on the homework, then we have nothing to look at unless I want to watch this video again. So it's important that you are writing every single thing that I do down. Yes, Tyler? Okay, it's in the first drawer of my desk. So then I need to plug this in to see if it really equals, oh sorry, it shouldn't equal negative 8.2, should it?
No.
It should be equal to 20.5. So then I want to multiply negative 2.5 times negative 8.5, or negative 8.2. And it gives me 20.5. So my answer is correct. Questions? Let's do one more, and then we'll get started on our notes. Homework, sorry. Alright, number 5. I've got negative 6 is equal to 4 over 7x. Negative 6 is equal to 4 over 7x. I want to solve for x. So how do I solve for x? Carla? Okay, I can divide both sides by 4/7, but remember, what was easier than dividing fractions? Multiply by my multiplicative inverse. So instead of dividing by fractions, I'm going to multiply both sides by its multiplicative inverse. So that means I'm multiplying 4 over 7x by what? 7 over 4. Whatever I do to one side, I have to do to the other side. That means I'm multiplying both sides by 7 over 4. When I do that, these two cancel, and it leaves me with an x. And then I have 7 over 4 times negative 6. If I multiply a positive times a negative, what do I know my answer is going to be?
Negative.
A negative. So then I have 7 over 4 times 6. And it gives me negative 10 and 1/2. If I'm checking it, remember it's easier to do it as a improper fraction. So how would I change this to an improper fraction? Okay, so that would give me negative 21 over 2. So if I want to check it, I'm going to plug in that improper fraction for x. So that means I have negative 6, which is equal to 4 over 7 times negative 21 over 2. When I plug it in, I have 4 over 7 times negative 21 over 2. And I get negative 6. So if I'm multiplying a number by a variable, and I want to solve for that variable, how do I solve it? By multiplying its multiplicative inverse. Okay. Any questions? All right, your homework is page 224, numbers 13 through 34. So everybody should get your book out and you should be starting on the homework.